I've heard some people say that the reason that Grok 3 has this incredible performance was that it was able to be trained on this Coherent cluster that was 3 times bigger than the next largest Coherent cluster at least. And so maybe that would be like the Gavin Baker camp. And then I've heard other people say, well, the fact that Grok 3 wasn't like dramatically better than O3 proves that you've kind of hit a wall on the marginal returns that you're getting training on a larger Coherent cluster. How do you...
Well, what about GPT 4.5? I mean, GPT 4.5 is sort of the best, more recent data point where it's not a reasoning model, but, look, I mean, I'm sort of ambivalent a little bit about 4.5 because I love it I use it for a lot of things. It's really awesome at writing. It's great at like anything fact-based. Like if you're doing some medical diagnostic thing, it'll have more encyclopedic knowledge about like all the side effects of like every drug because it just has more parameters. It can just fit more kind of fact-based knowledge about the world. But its performance on, a lot of important downstream tasks like programming and stuff is like not that much better. But the cost to serve are just absolutely gargantuan. Like, it's like 20 times more expensive, 15 to 20 times more expensive than GPT-4o. That's like a really big, and it's not 20 times better. But it's like, maybe it's like, 14% better or something like that. So you're talking about 15 to 20x inference cost, at least 10x training cost to get a 14% performance gain. And then it's like, it's actually so expensive. Like, I don't even think it really makes sense to use it as the base of a reasoning model because that would really get very expensive. Maybe you distill it down to a smaller version, heavily quantized, that could then be a great base for a reasoning model. I'm sure they'll do that.
Or at the very least, do what DeepSeek did and, not run inference on every single expert in the mixture of experts architecture while you're...
Sure. But going back to your question about coherent clusters, I think that's very real. I mean, every node is exactly the same. Every node has the same memory bandwidth, same CPU speed. It just simplifies the way you could reason about this training. Training is all about sort of perpetuating this fictional abstraction that you have one computer, not a bunch of like not a bunch of sort of separate nodes that have to communicate with each other. And that's a lot easier to think about if you could think about each GPU even across physical computer boundaries. Like, these are different, CPU like controlling, this.
Yeah, almost thinking about them like cores instead of
separate. Exactly. And the thing about like when whenever you see these multi-core chips, like in an AMD CPU that has 32 cores, usually all 32 of those cores are the same. And because that means that they run at the same clock speed or maybe not necessarily that, but like they have the same memory bandwidth, and it simplifies things because now you can think about them as all kind of being fed data. I mean, where things get off kilter is when one thing, one part of it is going faster than another part, and now they kind of get out of sync, and the one part can't continue the calculation until it gets the results from this other part, and it kind of gets this bottleneck and kind of traffic jam, if you will. And so if every, compute unit is consuming data at the same speed and processing the data at the same speed, it's sort of simple. You could think of it almost as like, those champagne glass things where you just pour the water, champagne at the top and it flows nicely into all of them at the same rate. They all fill up at the end. If you did it right, they all basically have the same amount of champagne in them and everything's great. Whereas if you have some of them are A100, some of them are H100s, some B200s, and maybe some weird custom silicon things, then it's going to be all screwed up and you're going to have some of the glasses overflowing while the other ones barely got any in them. And then you get more bugs and problems. You have to like stop the training runs and store them from checkpoints. And you just get these numerical stability problems that's like the sort of good case is that you realize that the thing crashed and then you can restore it from the backup. The sort of more insidious case is where you don't realize that anything
I just lost billions
wrong.
of dollars.
Well, no, it's not even that. It's like I'd say that's obviously the disaster case too, in which case you would just restore from a checkpoint. But no, the worst is when your model's just subtly like getting dumber, but you don't. It's like when you do a bad quantization of a model where it's like you can't even put your finger on it exactly, but it just lost some IQ points. It's like getting hit in the back of the head with a lead pipe, but you don't even know that it happened. And it's like getting slightly dumber. Or in some cases, you don't even have the counterfactual because you never got the model trained in a coherent way. And so it's just subtly worse in ways that maybe could have been avoided if you did have a coherent cluster. And yeah, sure, there's some truth to that. But I mean, I think also it's like the way people were taking pre-training scaling before all this, I think was too extreme. People talking about, the Stargate that, okay, we went from $1 to $2 billion training clusters to $10 to $15 billion. Okay, now the next stop is $100 billion. And it's just like, well, does that really make sense? Do we even have enough training tokens to make this work? Does it really make sense to have these massive models? Or are there actually much smarter, more elegant algorithmic approaches to getting better performance? And if that's the case, and it's interesting. So I gave you the sort of analysis how I processed the DeepSeek news when it was like, oh, they have 7-8 times the inference efficiency, and I said, oh well, that means inference has to go up by this amount, or else you're going to have more slack. But another analysis that I've seen which I have not independently re-derived, but I've seen now 2 different people on Twitter kind of post about this, which is that if you simply take the DeepSeek inference efficiency and you extrapolate that across sort of all the GPUs that are already in existence in data centers out there in the world today, that means that we have enough existing GPU compute capacity that it's enough to generate 10,000 tokens a day for every man, woman, and child on planet Earth of like an R1v3 level model, which is, basically state-of-the-art model. And it's like demand is not even remotely that high because there's a lot of people in like rural China and India who don't, use any tokens, right? And it's like, so it's just sort of another independent data point that it's like these efficiency gains are very impactful, in terms of like, sort of doesn't matter how you slice it or think about it, that these are very big increases here. But yeah, look, on the training side, yeah, the coherence is look, and this is why NVIDIA, no one's arguing that NVIDIA is like going away. But, the B200's already, first of all, the H100's still very capable, right? And there's a lot of these out there. And so using these training efficiencies, right? Because a lot of these DeepSeek things, they're applicable in all these different cases, right? Like it's sort of H100, B200, you could do all the same tricks you were doing before, but then layer in these tricks that they came up with. And now it's like you thought you were getting a 1 gigawatt data center. Now you really actually got a 5 gigawatt or 10 gigawatt data center effectively, right? And so it's sort of like that buys you a lot of, even if you still agree with everything that you were saying about coherence is good, blah, 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 you can now train a much bigger, better model, with the thing you already had, right? Like, and so, but that's not even the situation. The situation's like even way worse than that. It's that all these B200s, which are much faster, much more VRAM, much more memory bandwidth, many more cores than the H100, they've already been ordered. They've already sold over 12 billion of these things, in the last quarter, and shipments are ramping. And these are already like spoken for. They're already like gonna go into effect. And so if we're already in an effective like surplus situation, once everybody does implement these now look, one point to make is that, DeepSeek efficiency gains aren't necessarily directly applicable to every model that already exists. Okay. Like, for example, a lot of these things are sort of peculiar to an MOE, mixture of experts architecture. And so if you're talking about a completely dense model like Llama 3.3, 70 billion, maybe doesn't, directly carry over. But my answer to you is like, first of all, who the hell wants to use that model? It's now been outclassed by something that's a lot cheaper. And second of all, like whatever Llama 4 was going to be, it's been scrapped, and they're, doing it over using these tricks, because they'd be crazy to not, they'd be like Databricks, where it's like dead on arrival. Like, it's not going to be state of the art on day one. There's no point in doing it. And you're better off taking longer to come up with something that's at least state of the art for a few weeks, And so, and I think what's interesting about DeepSeek too is like they sort of inverted the process. Like, if you look at the way these models normally, it's like the theoretical teams at these big labs are sort of separate from the engineering teams in some way, where they sort of architect the model and they say, all right, this is the model, we got it prototyped. Now we're handing it over to you to figure out, the engineers to figure out how to make this thing run really fast. And I think with DeepSeek, they kind of started with, how can we make something?
How do we make it run fast?
How do we make it run fast? Not only that, how can we make it run fast on our crippled H800 GPUs? Because that's what we really can buy a lot of, which means super strong emphasis on reducing memory footprint and kind of the interconnect bandwidth that's required, because that's where they crippled it, is on the memory bandwidth. And so these smart algorithmic changes about doing stuff with like better kind of communication protocols, and like, but also just doing stuff at lower precision everywhere you can get away with it. And, especially on these like, KV indices and stuff, where you're able to train the thing end to end in this lower precision way, as opposed to training it in the high precision and then quantizing it, at the end. That means like, it just benefits you all across the board. I mean, you get the benefit of like, you can do it on fewer GPUs, right? Because it takes up less memory. But it's also like you could feed the data to the chip faster, because it's shoveling it in a more compressed format. But also it's like on the interconnect, when you're doing node to node communication, you're sending less data over the wire, because it's like in a sort of reduced precision.
Yeah, I mean, it's less computation on literally every single forward and back pass.
Yeah, and not just more, it's less data. It's like it's just so you're sending less over the wire. So it's like this win-win-win. That's, by the way, why the gains are so huge, is because they're these discrete things, but then the combined impact is multiplicative, where you have to multiply, like, oh, this gets you a 1.8 times boost, this gets you a 2.2 times, and then you have to multiply them together. That's how you can get these really big numbers. And so, yeah, I would say like, like just from all the stuff that's already been ordered and that's coming, and like you have a lot of compute to do a whole hell of a lot of innovation and improvement in state-of-the-art model. And then beyond that, it's like, barring some other big algorithmic invention, and I'm not talking now about necessarily efficiency gains, although that's also a big part of it. I'm talking about things like reasoning is like this sort of separate dimension that got added on to pre-training, where it just gave you all this new capabilities, like in a kind of different axis. It's got to be something like that, something more kind of innovative, where it's like, oh, we got a new optimizer that's better than Atom, like this thing Muon or Shampoo that people are talking about, or like we got, and it just finds sort of different, better models using pre-training. Or, there's this new stuff like diffusion LLMs, where like they, instead of generating tokens sequentially, like in an autoregressive way, they do it sort of as a noise reduction process, like the way image gen models work. Something like kind of radically different and new that comes out, that's like, I'd say barring that kind of thing, we're sort of like, getting to the point where the benefits seem to be slowing down on just doing the vanilla transformer on bigger parameter count models with more tokens, because like I said, like we're sort of out of training tokens that aren't synthetic, and certainly not enough to really move the needle in terms of like text, that's not synthetically generated. And then it's like, or you run into this problem of like, okay, the model's great, but who's going to pay 20 times as much per token for that? It's not like the other ones are good enough. I'll take the one that costs a nickel instead of $1, So that's sort of my answer. And look, all this stuff goes back to like, on the day I wrote that article, NVIDIA And a lot of these companies were sort of like pricing in like none of this stuff, even though it had already happened effectively. You just had to connect the dots and sort of like do the
narrative.
The narrative and the math, and just figure out what are the implications of all this. And that's sort of what the market's kind of caught up to now. And where it's like, no matter what else even happens, even if like you didn't have the Trump tariffs and all this other stuff that people are talking about, there'd still be this overhang, I think, and that would be spooking people.
So, and this is just kind of thinking off the top of my head here about one of the dynamics that I see in operation among especially the big hyperscalers, is this arms race on, feeling like if they don't have the ability to control their own destiny with a frontier model, that potentially their whole company goes kablooey. And that's why, Zuckerberg is willing to invest at the level that he's willing to invest in. Satya is willing to do a deal with someone as upcoming and unstable as Sam Altman to begin with. And, some of these dynamics. And what I'm wondering is, with Elon kind of showing that there is maybe still frontier progress room left to be made with these larger coherent models, and NVIDIA being really the only provider who can really put that scale of identical compute units together to do those large coherent training clusters. If even, notwithstanding everything that we've talked about, that maybe 2 or 3 players, as long as they feel like there's, that the race is still on and that it hasn't been decisively won, that a few of them will just continue to try to chase Elon in building these big clusters. I'm
skeptical. I just, because I think, if anything, things are starting to point the opposite direction, which is that the model intelligence is sort of becoming commoditized. And that what we thought was the big competitive edge and differentiator, that sort of narrative started collapsing when DeepSeek R1 with V3 came out, where it was like, this model's like really good and really cheap and was trained for cheap amount. And like, so, and like this sort of arms race, it's like,
that does undermine the arms race. Like if you feel like it's going to cost you $10 billion to stay in the arms race, and you're like, wait a second, this dude just showed up with the same thing for $500 million.
Of course, there's that. But then there's also, and then it's like a week later, the Alibaba guy comes out with the thing that's almost as good, but then it takes up 5% of the memory footprint. It's like, you're almost a sucker if you, and especially because I think there's increasingly clarity that the value is going to be captured at the app layer. Not the winner of all this sort of arms race, if you will, are companies like Palantir and like companies that can price to value, and capture the sort of surplus of value that they're creating for solving business problems.
And they have the sticky interface. It's a lot easier to switch out a model than it is to leave Foundry.
And the consumer mind share, like, your average man on the street doesn't even know what Claude is, but they do know what ChatGPT is now. And ChatGPT has a ton of mind share, and that's worth something. And, but I think you're already starting to see this with Microsoft and like Amazon. It was like, okay, Microsoft's with OpenAI, Amazon's with Anthropic, right? And especially like, because they have this big deal now where Anthropic's going to be using 400,000 of their Trainium 2 chips for training. So by the way, like NVIDIA's not the only one that'll have a coherent thing, because like you're going to have 400,000 identical Trainium chips. Now, each one won't be as good as a B200, but like, again, it's like if you got 400,000 and the other guy's only got, 100,000 or 200,000, maybe it's like good enough, right? And then don't forget about Google has their TPUs, which they don't really tell you that much about anymore, because they don't sell them anymore. But like, don't TPUs, V6, they're now on the 6th version, right? Like, you don't think that constitutes a coherent pool of compute? I think it does, right? I mean, now they haven't been doing that much with it. If you look at the quality of the models compared to, where you would think they should be, given that they freaking invented transformers and have had TPUs for 10
well,
years.
If they would get the HR department out of the,
it's like the most
consumer facing
shocking squandering of a lead. I don't know how Sundar still has a job, but that's neither here nor there.